Welcome back to Physical Geography. We're going to be talking about climate zones, biomes, and climate change this time round. Taking a look at the figure here on slide one, it's a world map with lots of colors on it. And there are actually, I think, 25 different climate subtypes in this map. Lots of variation in climates on Earth. So, one of the first things we want to ask ourselves is what's causing this variation? First of all, how do we define the variation? Why are there all these different colors used? And why is that so? So, in the text readings that go along with the lectures that we've had so far, we know that what makes up weather is atmospheric pressure, temperature, wind, and precipitation. So those four components are what gives us weather on any given day. And of course, climate is just the average of what the weather is over long periods of time. At least 3 decades of weather data will enable us to determine a climate type in any location on Earth. So with all of those components of weather, if we were try and define climate zones based on each of those four components, it would be even more complicated than it already is. So we distill down the weather data to simply temperature, range in temperature, and precipitation. Those two components of weather are the most critical, and therefore that's what we use to define different climate zones. Slide 2. So let's just look at some data. This is actually an animation looping a bunch of atmospheric moisture and precipitation. This comes from NASA's Earth Observatory satellite data, where we see orange, yellow, red colors. These are areas with high levels of precipitation. Where we see green, it's less precipitation. And where we see areas of white, it's not clouds, it's actually lack of precipitation. So we're seeing a lot of precipitation in the region close to the equator. But notice that line, that horizontal line that goes across from left to right, pretty much a line of red and yellow and orange and some green, is shifting south and north and south and north. And you can see the months of the year go by on the lower left there. So you're aware of the fact that there's seasons on Earth because of the Earth's tilt. We've already talked about this. You've read about it. That the zone of highest insolation, which we generally think of as being at the equator, but we know that zone migrates north to 23.5 degrees north and south to 23.5 degrees south throughout the year, and that is how we define the tropics. Slide 3. So because this talk is not going to discuss each of the 25 different climate zones, I'd like to focus on tropical areas. So let's look at the tropical humid climates. We already know that they're going to be in the band between approximately 23.5 degrees north and 23.5 degrees south. And there are 3 subtypes of tropical humid A climates. They're in the letter A. And these all share some things in common. They all have very high sun angles throughout the year, and therefore high levels of insolation or incoming solar radiation. They all share another quality, which is that they have high year-round annual temperatures, and they do have high annual precipitation and high humidity levels. The tropical humid climates are noted really for their lack of coldness. They're not actually the hottest places on Earth, okay, as you've probably read. Even though they're closer to the equator and have very high levels of insolation, the hottest places on Earth are the dry desert climates, which happen to be closer to, say, 25 degrees north and south. These tropical humid climates are the winterless climates, if you will. There is really no winter in the tropics. And sometimes people say that nighttime is the winter in the tropics because when you get the coldest temperatures in the tropics, it's at night or just before the sun rises at dawn. Slide 4. So I want to first talk about this graph because this graph, I'm going to be showing a few of these and you will have seen them in your textbook, is an important graph. We call it a climograph. And all of the climographs are going to be organized in the same way. So along the X or horizontal axis, notice that you have the letter J all the way through the letter D. So those are the months of the year, January, February, March, April, etc. On the left, we have precipitation levels, which are given in millimeters. So, for example, in the month of January, here we're looking at a graph for Iquitos, Peru. We can see there's approximately 260 millimeters of precipitation because we're looking at that blue bar. The right vertical axis has temperature in degrees C on it. And that corresponds to that red line with the little red kind of diamonds in it. Okay, so notice throughout the year how almost perfectly straight that temperature line is. In other words, if you take your average daily temperature every single day and average that into a month, there is almost no change in temperature in this climograph for Iquitos. In other words, the tropical wet climates, this is a very typical climograph for any region in a tropical wet climate. You're going to have very little annual temperature change. Another thing to notice is the level of the blue bars, so the amount of precipitation. Yeah, there is some variation. It looks like July and August have the lowest levels of precipitation throughout the year, and the month of March has the highest. But overall, we could say that there is rainfall every single month of the year. The island of Kauai in Hawaii, this is in the AF or tropical wet climate zone, and portions of it, I should say, are. And Kauai has an area with the highest average annual precipitation of any place on Earth, actually, believe it or not, with an average of 460 inches of rain per year. Now compare that with Santa Cruz. What would be the average amount of precipitation annually in Santa Cruz? Something around, say, 35 inches per year. And this region of Kauai on the north side of the island has 460 inches per year on average. Now let's look at this climograph for a tropical savanna climate zone, the AW climate zones. This one comes from Dakar, Senegal. And the savannas are known for their extensive grasslands. They're also, if we look at the climograph, we can see there's a very short rainy season. Most of the year, it's very dry. There's none or almost no precipitation. Another thing we can notice about this climograph in comparison with the one from Iquitos, Peru, is that there's a little more variation in the annual temperature range. Again, we're in the tropics, so it's not going to be very extreme. It's still going to be warm year round, but there definitely is a cooler time of the year and a hotter time of the year. And the tropical monsoon climate zones, this one comes from India. We also notice that there is a period of the year, mainly December through, say, March, where there's little to almost no rainfall. And then there's very high levels of rainfall in the rainy or monsoonal season, which extends from about May, June through November. Just an interesting statistic here about an area. Actually, this comes from India, a place called Cherrapunji, India. They had a record 1-year precipitation of 1,042 inches of rainfall in 1 year, and the greatest 1-month precipitation of 366 inches. So again, you don't necessarily get the highest average rainfall in the tropical monsoonal climate zones, but when it rains, intensely, you can have extreme levels of precipitation. Slide 5. So now let's talk about a very important biome that exists in the A climates, and it's known as the tropical rainforest biome. So a biome, of course, is a large, recognizable assemblage of plants and animals that are living in functional interaction with each other and with their environment, with the particularly the climatic components of that physical environment. So the tropical rainforest biome is known for its broadleaf evergreen forests, having, I think there are 5 distinct layers in the forest, of sort of vertical layers from the forest floor through the shrub layer, the understory, the canopy, and then the emergent layer. With respect to fauna in a tropical rainforest biome, amphibians, particularly frogs, and many different insect species, as well as birds and monkeys, snakes, lizards, fish, etc. There are also larger animals, which tend to be fewer in abundance. One of the really amazing qualities about a tropical rainforest biome is its biodiversity. And it does have, of all land biomes, so we're not talking about the oceans here, but of all land biomes, it has the largest biodiversity. And biodiversity is the number of different species. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you have a large number of any one species. So you might say, well, there's tons of insects in the tropical rainforest biome. Yes, there are, but there's smaller populations of many, many different types of insects. Whereas maybe in a place like the tundra, you might have an incredible number of species of one kind of species, like a particular mosquito, for example, in the tundra. Very different from the tropical rainforest biome. There's many different kinds of species, and this is what makes that region so biodiverse. So just be clear on the distinction between biodiversity and what we call species abundance. Okay, species abundance means lots of one particular kind of species. Large biodiversity means smaller numbers, but of many, many different types of species. Slide 6. So a question that ecologists and biologists have been trying to answer is, why do the tropics, particularly the AF climates or the tropical rainforest biomes, have the largest biodiversity of all land biomes? What is the reason for that? And really, the jury is still out. There is not 100% consensus among the scientific community as to why that is. But I want to present to you 5 competing hypotheses right now. The first of which is called the geographical area hypothesis. So this essentially means that tropical areas are large. If we look at the land masses, take a look at a world map, and just look at the amount of square kilometers of Earth area above sea level, there's more land mass in tropical regions than there are at higher latitudes. So this hypothesis simply says you got more land area, you're going to have more biodiversity because there's more area for species to exist. Another hypothesis, which is the species energy hypothesis, proposes that in tropical areas, because you have higher insolation, there's more photosynthetic energy, and therefore you have more biological productivity. You have more plant matter growing, and therefore that provides the resources for all other kinds of species, which leads to more species richness or greater biodiversity. Another competing idea is known as the climate harshness variability hypothesis, meaning that other climate zones in the world are much harsher. They experience greater shifts in temperature throughout the year, or less moisture levels throughout the year, and that makes a harsher environment in which fewer species can survive. So if you have a less harsh environment, like in the tropics, it's going to enable more species to live throughout the year. Yet another hypothesis that's out there in the scientific scientific community is known as the evolutionary rate hypothesis. And if we think about, and we haven't actually talked about it yet, and we will be, but if we think about the fact that the Earth over geologic time has experienced many shifts in climate, okay, extreme changes between ice ages and interglacial periods, in the tropics, because of the region, the latitudinal region where they're located, they're going to undergo less extremes in climate change than areas at higher latitudes will over geologic kinds of climate shifts. And finally, perhaps a silly hypothesis, but yet it is out there, and something that scientists are discussing, is a fancy way of saying that this is all completely random, and the scientific community has decided to call that the mid-domain effect, meaning that, you know, it just could be some random reason that the tropics have this incredible biodiversity. I think that really it's probably likely that it's a combination of many of these factors, and that not one of these hypotheses is actually going to emerge as the kind of catch-all reason. So regardless of what the reason for this incredible richness in biodiversity is, we do know that the tropics, because of the great biodiversity in both fauna and flora, provide one particular benefit to humanity, which is that many of the medicines that we use today to cure all kinds of ailments and disease come from derivatives out of the tropical rainforests. So we are able to look at, to identify and to use plants, particularly plants from the rainforests, to develop cures for all kinds of medical problems. Slide 7. So what are some impacts that human activities are having in the tropical rainforests? This satellite view here from Brazil, above Brazil, from the Earth Observatory website, shows us classic, what we call fishbone deforestation. So what happens is probably the government wants to help people to settle a new area. And again, this is in Brazil. So they may build a road. So you'll see sort of a big strip of white through the lower half of the image there. And then tracts of land are either given away or sold for settlement. So people build roads out to their tracts of land. So you can see these sort of rib bones, if you will, of the fish. So this is classic fishbone deforestation. Now notice in the right portion of, the left portion of the image, that fishbone development can get so kind of cut up that there's barely any forest left. So these are areas that just have fragments of forest left in them. There is a region in the sort of center top, which has a very dark green tone to it. It's undisturbed forest, so this region has not yet been deforested. And then above that, there's a patch of kind of a salmony pink color. And this is a region that was deforested, but is actually beginning to regrow. Now, there's a real difference in the color of these two undisturbed forest region and the regrowth. So that has to do with the density of the vegetation, particularly the density of the vegetation. Stop. So reduction in tropical rainforests, in the tropical rainforest biome, is mainly from human settlement due to logging activities and agricultural activities. And this ultimately results in a loss of habitat. It's going to impact the biodiversity of these regions. Some species may actually not be able to survive in regions where it's being deforested very rapidly. There's also a great loss of nutrients from the system because unlike in, say, a deciduous forest or a grassland, like a savanna region, the nutrients are not held in the soils in the rainforest. All the nutrients are contained within the vegetation. So when that vegetation is removed, you're left with soils that really don't have the nutrients to sustain agricultural practices for long periods of time. Another thing is that as habitat and species and biodiversity is decreased as deforestation increases, if a quarter of all of our medicines come from rainforest plants, and many plants have not even been identified in the tropical rainforests of the world. We haven't even mapped, if you will, all of the biodiversity that exists there. We're literally losing potential medicines, potential cures for humanity by losing this biodiversity. One other point, it has been proposed that approximately 40% of the oxygen in our atmosphere comes from the tropical rainforests. So remove that vegetation. What are some of the atmospheric impacts? We don't really know.